It feels like it's been forever since I played as Samus. You'd think that I would have reviewed a Metroid game on this channel since I've started it, with the whole Metroidvania genre being one of my favorites. But I haven't had a chance to, considering the series has sort of been in limbo. Now, I could have done a retro review and that would have made sense. Or hell, at least played a Metroid game on the channel by this time, 3 years after its inception.
I mean, it's obviously part of, and I love this sequence. This is like, it's like somebody was watching a little bit too much like Sailor Moon, because that's what this reminds me of, like the early episodes of Sailor Moon, or the transformation sequence.
That doesn't count. Anyway, Metroid Samus Returns came out for the Nintendo 3DS on September 15, 2017 for $39.99. It's a remake of the 1991 Game Boy game Metroid 2 Return of Samus, as you take control of the iconic bounty hunter and attempt to continue your mission of saving the galaxy by killing as many problems as you're asked to. With a new adventure on the horizon with Metroid Prime 4 coming, it's nice to see Samus get back to her 2D roots, even if the road here was a little bit bumpy on the way. But before I begin, you're probably wondering why this review is labeled an audio review. Well, here's the thing. I don't have a 3DS capture card right now. Now, I've wanted to pick one up, but every time I attempt to get one, it seems the stock is sold out. And frankly, the price is really expensive for a system that I'm playing less and less. Normally, I wouldn't even bother reviewing the game and just play it on its own, and give my opinion on it on Twitter and the like. But Metroid is different. This is a franchise that I love, so I feel obligated to look at it critically. So, for those wanting my opinion and put on the audio in the background, nothing changes for you, you still hear my review in its whole. But for those visual people out there, how do I change this review? Do I borrow footage from other YouTubers? Well, for certain parts of this review, yes, but that person will be credited for it, of course, because that's the least you can do. However, for other parts of the review, I want to do something a little bit different. So I thought, why not use this as an opportunity to show other games in the genre? So I'll do just that. You'll see other games that may interest you if you are interested in Samus Returns, all being of the Metroidvania genre. I'll of course link to those reviews I've done for those games as well, with the card system or in the description below. It's an experiment, but I want to see where this goes, and frankly, I want to talk about Metroid Samus Returns, so this gives me the avenue to do so. So with that said, was it good that Samus returned to the limelight? Or will I return this game to my local game shop? Or will you get sick of me using return puns by the end of this review? Let's find out, shall we? Let's get the story out of the way first. Now, the Metroid series has a lot of great lore and storytelling hidden under its layers of gameplay. However, you have to remember that Samus Returns is a remake of Metroid 2, which was a Game Boy game. The Game Boy wasn't exactly known for its epic storytelling experiences. It focused more on the gameplay in most cases. Here's the gist of things. Samus is called in to deal with a series of Metroids and wipe them from the face of the universe. That's it. There was an away team that came to the planet, they got themselves killed, and Samus is now charged with picking up the pieces. You don't get to know anything about that away team, or hell, even know their names. They are dead, move on, you've got Metroids to kill. Now let's be clear, the Metroid series has never been heavy in the story department, at least in the direct in-your-face manner. A bounty hunter by herself can only do so much in character development on her own against creatures with unknown motives. Most of the story is implied, or coming from diaries or data in the game series, along with environmental storytelling. It still worked enough to keep you interested, especially in the Prime series and games like Super Metroid. But in Samus Returns, that's really limited. There's no lore to find here. In fact, you're completely reliant on environmental storytelling, and that causes even more confusion in this game. For example, I understand this statue is one of the game's mechanics to tell you how many Metroids are in an area before you move on. But who built this statue? What is its purpose? Why is it here? I really wish I could tell you, but I have no answers to a lot of the questions like that I have that Metroid 2 introduces. To be quite honest with you, I don't think Samus Returns wants you to ask those questions, because it really doesn't make sense in the end. Hell, when the series finally tries to connect some of the events prior to this game to Samus Returns, it feels forced in there more than anything else, rather than a natural progression. When I look in the game's environments, I don't see that detail that I expect to give me a story of consequence here. The environments don't have the structures or the secondary detail to suggest a history of what happened. Bodies found don't really suggest anything other than this man died. I admit, I may be expecting too much of this remake, but it was an ample opportunity to add story into the game to make things a little bit more connected in the series, or to at least introduce Samus to a whole new generation of kids. I mean, let's face it, how many kids actually know who Samus is other than that she's playable in Super Smash Bros? Not as many as you'd think. I mean, for God's sakes, Kid Icarus had a more recent release. Okay, so the game isn't exactly a story powerhouse, and doesn't really add much when it comes to the overall story of the Metroid series. So let's get into the meat of why you'd pick up Samus Returns, the gameplay. Now, Samus Returns is starting off in one of the most unique positions in the game release schedule. No, seriously, think about it. It's the first Metroid game that has come out in years, since Metroid Other M. No, Federation Force does not count. This is a series that people have been clamoring for years now to continue. If it stumbles, it could mean that Nintendo feels justified in letting Metroid go away for a period of time, very similar to Star Fox and very similar to other franchises like F-Zero. It also comes off the heels of the AM2R remake that was shut down by Nintendo, and yet the AM2R team gives Samus Returns its blessing because they want to see more Metroid games. That's why they took the project up in the first place. It's also a genre that I absolutely love, and one that actually can make me, the anti-hype train, actually hype for something. So how is the game? It's alright. Look, the problem with Samus Returns is simple. It's great and bad at the same time. You get glimpses of what made this series one of the defining in the genre here. One that you have to give some leeway, however, because this is a remake of a game that came out in 1991. Granted, they fixed some elements of the gameplay that I'll get to in a bit, but we've come a long way from the days of the Game Boy, and it painfully shows at times here. Let's start with the game's structure first. The mapping gameplay can be divided into 8 main areas. When you enter an area, you'll come across one of these statues, which will light up with a series of Metroids that you'll have to find and kill in the area. Now this begins what I think is the most enjoyable part of Samus Returns: exploration. The structure in these areas are the same. You'll make your way through cave innards and various hazards to get to new locations. You'll run into doors and areas that you won't be able to get to at first, due to not having the right ability. Sometimes you'll have to come back once you get the right upgrade, but if it's a critical one, it's somewhere in the general area that you can get right now. Now, when you're going around first exploring an area and coming across new enemies, puzzles, and hazards, the game is a lot of fun. A good amount of that is the level design in conjunction with the various enemies and the game's controls. This is especially in the first part of the game. You feel like you have to be a bit careful as your energy meter is low and you take damage rather easily. You're getting used to the controls, which match the gameplay rather nicely. You're jumping the various ledges of different heights, having to time your jumps so that you don't run into things, and get the angle you need to start hitting some of your energy shots. There's childish wonder that comes from coming across an area and figuring out how to get through it. Even the cases of it being obvious of what you need to do. There's something to fitting Samus through the tight holes and getting through by the skin of your teeth that makes me remember how much I love this genre. You can all take all those survival games you want, but this is my survival genre, and when it's done right, it's done to almost perfection. Now, I'm not going to say that Samus Returns is perfect in this area. Some of the level design is something I like to term as dickish. There are certain parts that require specific powers to use. Powers that, if they aren't used, will cause you to reset your progress in getting through the puzzle. The most common of these will be the time slowing power, the spider ball, and the blocks that require a specific power to blow up and then regenerate after a period of time. For the sake of simplicity, I'm going to use the time stop mechanic to explain my problem here. Now, you look at this tunnel. Can you tell me if you see any indication that you need to use your time stop power on this? There's hundreds of tunnels of this length in the game. The only usual indication is that there's an upgrade at the end of the tunnel, and even that can be hit and miss, which means that several areas turn into trial and error, which can get extremely annoying, especially if you just so happen to be low on the extra energy that charges the slowed down mechanic. Now, this is despite Mercury Steam adding some elements to the game that take away some other problems of the series level design wise. For example, Samus gets some nice additions to her control set here, and two of them stand out. First is the dedicated button allowing her to stand still and aim in all directions. It's tied to the left bumper, and the ease of aiming backwards to launch a series of missiles into a foe's face, only to quickly return to moving and running for your life. This addition is really fantastic. In fact, it makes you feel like a badass. It's almost too powerful against certain enemies though, but this new addition gave them a bit more freedom in enemy placement and level design, so I'm willing to let that slide. The second great addition is the scan pulse power. One of the more cited weaknesses of some of the older Metroid games is how certain breakable blocks can seem to be huge leaps of logic in terms of discoverability. Donkey's review on Samus Returns actually highlights this rather well, and rather than me just rehashing his argument, I'll let the man speak for himself.
Here, trying to wall jump out, trying to bomb the floor with my thing, trying to shoot every tile with a missile. There's no way. You're stuck here. You're stuck here for the rest of the game. And fuck this game. Why in the name of a dog's dick would anyone think to blow that up?
So using the scan pulse to highlight those blocks at a button press? Rather appreciated. And it's one of those things you don't have to use either. You can play the game the old school way and be just fine. But for those who don't want to waste time blasting missiles at various random blocks that look a little funky, you've got a nice tool in your arsenal to help with that. Staying on the controls, there are some blemishes here despite the new additions. Switching between different weapon types via the touchscreen always felt off. I wish that a combination of the D-pad and the right bumper would allow you to switch between weapons, as both by themselves are used for other things. Having to change to something like the grapple beam always caused me to stop and take a second to do so, really hurting the rhythm of the game. It felt that Samus herself was literally stopping to bring up her gun arm to manually change the weapon, and that just doesn't do for Samus. Okay, but how about the combat? Well, that's where things are a little less positive in my mind. Don't get me wrong, fighting through a series of creatures all with unique patterns or weaknesses can be fun in Samus Returns, especially early on. You've got creatures that will dart towards you, making you panic as you jump away or hope that you do enough damage before you hit them. Then you'll run into an enemy that you can't defeat until later in the game, and have to carefully make your way around it. But with that said, one of the biggest problems I saw with the game was Samus' growth as a protagonist, as in becoming too much of a powerhouse for regular enemies. Now, this isn't a straightforward problem, mostly due to the Metroidvania genre as a whole. With upgrades out of the way and hundreds of them to pick up, trying to balance a game that could have some people pick up every single one while others avoid them like the plague, yeah, that's pretty difficult. But my issue with Samus Returns is that balance seems to be a bit more biased towards the avoidance side. Around Area 5 is when I realized that enemies, despite doing damage to me, weren't really scaling that well in terms of that damage. I had about 4 to 5 energy tanks at that point, and the damage they were doing was taking a little bit from me, but not a whole lot. And enemies seem to drop replenishment items like a grandmother throws out candy during Halloween. That led to me just avoiding enemies and running by them and taking the hit, or getting reckless with my items. I use missiles in this game like Reese's mini cups when I'm depressed, aka I'm going through a whole bag of them in a couple of days. And yet, I didn't seem to run out ever. The energy issue in this game in particular is one that I feel needed a lot of rework here. Save points in the game don't regenerate your energy, so early on that energy that you lose, you really feel that. But again, that went away about a third of the way through the game. Thus began this weird back and forth of the strengths of this game, pulling against the weaknesses when it comes to the gameplay section. The core mechanics, the core concepts, they all work and are designed reasonably well. But then they start to tie together, and things don't necessarily work well in conjunction. It left me with this wave-like pattern of enjoyment. I'd be having a bunch of fun 1 minute, but then feel like I was just going through the motions in the next. Which may confuse you. I mean, if it's a Metroidvania game that does a lot of things right in level design, gives you a bunch of good enemies to fight, and makes you feel like a badass, then really it should be a home run throughout the game, right? Well, again, when finding new things or facing new baddies, it definitely is. But the biggest factor that started to tilt the scales was the repetition. This all has to do with the main gameplay mechanic. The formulaic nature of hunting and killing Metroids, and doing the same thing there over and over again, starts to become rather clear by Area 3 of the game, and it comes with some bad balance decisions during that time. Like I mentioned before, your whole goal is to take down the Metroids, and they have about 5 to 6 forms that they come at you with during the game. Each form does add a little bit of challenge when first introduced, and requires you to adapt to new firing patterns or actions. That's great! The game then proceeds to bury that experience 10 feet in the ground when it does it for the second, third, fourth, and fifth time, usually in a row. I can't stress this enough, especially with how the boss battles are structured overall. When it comes to avoiding damage, you're going to be fine as long as you figure out what exactly the game wants you to do to avoid the attack. Skill isn't necessarily the primary factor here, it's pattern and situational recognition. If a boss is using a vacuum attack to try to suck you in, for example, you need to realize that you should use the spider ball to attach yourself to the wall so it can't get you. If you can't recognize that, you're gonna have a bad time. The flip side here is that when you do, you're probably not going to take damage during the later battles of the same type, at least not as much. Skills does still take a part in some of these scenarios, but the skill ceiling of timing I found wasn't necessarily that difficult to master here. I get it, I've grown as a player, but you've taken it way too far in this scenario. The series' history doesn't help this. The thing is, the Metroid series has some fantastic varied boss battles, and Samus Returns has them too. Most of them occur in Area 6 and afterward, when the game finally decides to slow down with the Metroid requirement and introduce something else into the mix. Those bosses, by the way, can be fantastic, even if they gave me a little bit of frustration on their first go around. Overall, Samus Returns is a mixed bag of gameplay. The controls additions and some of the powers are rather nice additions, taking some of my complaints with the series away. On the other hand, the game steers too far off the original course and becomes repetitive in the worst of ways at certain points. Let's wrap things up with some discussion surrounding the game's presentation. Now, I have to admit something from the get-go. Samus Returns was playing from behind when it came to this review. That's because of one thing: AM2R. I like that presentation style a lot more than this one. Granted, I understand that they are on different platforms and have their own different strengths, but frankly to me, AM2R just looks so much better to me than Samus Returns. But in terms of this review, I have to try to step back and take a look at what this presentation does well. Because to be honest, the AM2R style doesn't necessarily fit the atmosphere that Metroid 2 is going for. I mean, this is supposed to be an oppressive world, one filled with horrors and dangerous creatures. You can make arguments for the creatures being colorful, as many creatures with poisonous spit or odd defense mechanisms have bright colors to warn their enemies at times. But with that said, the haunting and foreboding cave formations and dark and dreary nature of this presentation add to this game's atmosphere a lot. Samus is alone on this world. You can feel the sadness dripping off the walls, and it plays into everything trying to kill you, even the lava and the acid water. This isn't a planet full of life. It's a planet full of death, if that makes sense to you. However, there's a good reason why I prefer the AM2R style over the Samus Returns version, and it all comes down to the detail, specifically when it comes to the creatures you face. I mean, just take a look at a side-by-side comparison here of Metroids within both universes. Obviously, the AM2R's Metroid's 3 nuclei, eyes, power spheres, anyway, are a lot more noticeable at first glance than the Samus Returns version. It ends up giving the creature more character, like those nuclei are a source of its power. See, despite all the details still being present in the Samus Returns version, hell, even more so when you look at it really closely, that's the problem. You have to look really closely to really see that detail. Like literally my face against the screen with my eyes glued to it to see the detail on these creatures. And you're too busy dealing with the gameplay to really notice it when you're actually playing through it, as opposed to me looking at it for a review. It doesn't help that the lasers and energy effects feel so dead compared to other games. Like, yeah, you could tell it's a wave beam and that it's concentrated energy, but there's no vibrance to it. It feels like the energy has been drained out of the weapon's burst. Now, other Metroid games have had this problem for sure, but it was really, really evident in Samus Returns, and I don't know why. Now, some may call my criticism harsh here. The game doesn't look that bad when you compare other games of the genre on the 3DS when it comes down to it. And I will admit, some of my problems has to do with the history of Metroid games and them always seeming to leave an imprint on me in terms of moving forward in presentation for the console or handheld it was on. I remember being astonished when I first played Super Metroid visually. I remember Zero Mission feeling completely new compared to other Game Boy Advance games at the time. When I look at Zero Mission, and yeah, it's on the console towards the end of its lifespan, it just doesn't compare. As for sound and music, you need to note something right from the get-go here. A pair of headphones are required to play this game. Not because of any technical issues or anything, but to really appreciate the atmosphere that this game's sound design has to offer. The speakers of the 3DS just don't have the hardware here to fully appreciate the sound design. Sorry, it's true. This is most evident in the game's music. This is the quintessential example of music being appropriate for the gameplay and subject matter. The game's music combines what you'd expect from horror movies, using crescendos and haunting melodies, and combining it with high action and tension moments with loud drum sections to nail the point home. The music is oppressive as you make your way through the game, implying mystery while still being generally unnerving. One of my tests when playing games is to turn off the music and see how much it affects the experience. Let me tell you, Samus Returns is the prime example of why I do the test. So many of the game's moments are enhanced thanks to the game's soundtrack, even beyond the boss battles or set pieces. Just making progress along in the map is so much better when you've got the soundtrack accompanying it. Hell, I'm gonna be honest here. I almost added a enhancer to the score for a person who is deaf. That's how much it affects the overall experience. Now, granted, I felt that was in poor taste and changed it to something a little bit more reasonable. But just listen to hear what I'm talking about. Now let's talk sound design. This isn't necessarily as strong as the music here, and it's a mixed bag to say the least. Something about some of these sound effects feel like their impact has been reined back a bit. Creature cries happen, but they don't necessarily make me feel like these beasts are alive. The shots of your gun are there, but they don't necessarily feel powerful per se. But then you get really good effects, like the sound of your beam charging up, or the sound effect of a mechanical door opening being easy to pick out of all the other sounds. I think all the sound design here was purposeful. They wanted to give less focus on more of the common sounds, things like firing your gun. But in doing so, something got lost in the translation. It also allows the atmospheric music and white noise to shine a bit more here, which is appreciated. I don't know. Take a listen and hear for yourself. I have to admit, Metroid Samus Returns left me a bit disappointed. Granted, it wasn't a game that I played on the Game Boy originally. I ended up becoming a Samus fanboy with Super Metroid, and going back and playing the original one, and skipped this game in the series my first go-around. So I was really looking forward to seeing what I had missed here. And I'm not going to say that I didn't enjoy parts of it. It was nice to get back into the perspective of Samus. The controls are still great, the level design is still fun, and the combat still works. It's just here, the formula takes those ingredients and combines them together in a way that's a bit off. The game gets too repetitive at parts, really stretching the formula too far and breaking the balance of the gameplay at times while doing it. The lack of varied boss battles till the end really makes the game feel like a grind at times, and when the game puts hazards in front of you that seem to slow you down for no good reason, it just feels like it's there to make your life more difficult. On top of that, while the presentation has its own strengths, I can't help but want AM2R's presentation instead, with its more vivid color and focus on unique details. With all that taken into account, Samus comes back not in the blaze of glory, but showing up with the rest of the gang, scoring a 76 out of 100. Meaning if the Metroidvania genre is your thing, then it's worth a buy right now. Otherwise, this game is one to wait for a sale on. And given Nintendo's history, you're probably going to be waiting a while for that. But like always, that doesn't take into account my enhancer system. Games are too varied nowadays, and there's so many games out there that matching the games to you and your wants just makes a lot of sense. So while my base score tries to be as objective as possible, my enhancer system tries to take the more subjective elements and put them into score form. So if you fall into one of the following categories, add or subtract them to your base score to get your final score. If the first digit of your base score changes, refer to my scoring guide to see where the game's buyability lies for you. Now, if you want to help out this channel, I only have one thing to ask of you. Leave a comment on how you think I can improve my reviews in the comment section below. I'm not going to ask for likes or subs because I think they should be earned, and the best way to do that is to up the quality of my videos, especially for this one. I believe I could do more reviews if I do some audio ones from time to time for more handheld or mobile-based experiences. So the feedback of if this format works is worth even more to me. Coming up next on the channel is a review of Cuphead, with video this time, and then one of those game design videos I've been talking about for a while now. Anyway, I'll see you next time, and as always, keep on gaming.